I want to tell you about a feeling I remember very specifically. It was a Tuesday morning and I opened my banking app like I did every morning, half expecting the number to somehow be smaller than I left it the night before, which is a kind of financial anxiety I think a lot of us know intimately. And for the first time in my adult life, the number on the screen had 5 digits before the decimal point. $10,000, my own money, saved, sitting there. I remember putting my phone down and just sitting with that for a minute. Because if you have ever been in a place where an unexpected $400 expense was a genuine crisis, where you were doing the mental math on whether you could afford to get sick this month, where you checked your balance before every grocery run just to make sure, you know that $10,000 feels like more than a number. It feels like a completely different relationship with your own life. Like the ground got more solid under your feet overnight. And then over the following months, I watched that number start to erode. Not dramatically, not all at once. Slowly and then faster, and then suddenly I was back below $6,000, wondering what happened and feeling genuinely confused because I had not made any single dramatic decision that explained the gap. I was not alone in this. When I started talking to people about their saving experiences, and when I started studying the behavioral research around what actually happens after people hit their first major savings milestone, I found the same pattern playing out across thousands of people with different incomes, different backgrounds, and different financial situations. The savings go up, the milestone gets hit. And then somewhere in the following 6 to 12 months, a significant portion of it quietly disappears. Today, I want to dig into exactly why that happens, because the reason is not what most people assume. It is not a lack of discipline. It is not a math problem. It is a psychological trap that is almost perfectly designed to undo the exact thing you worked so hard to build. And once I show you the mechanism, I think you are going to recognize it immediately. Because I guarantee you have already felt it working on you, even if you did not have a name for it. Subscribe right now if you are new here. Let's get into this. Let me start with the trap itself, because I want to name it clearly before I explain the psychology behind it. The trap is this: most people treat saving $10,000 the exact same way they treat going on a diet. They restrict aggressively to hit the goal. They hit the goal, they feel the relief and the accomplishment, and then often without even fully realizing it, they relax. The restriction that felt temporary because it was framed as temporary comes to an end. Old patterns reassert themselves. And the account balance starts drifting back toward wherever it came from. I call this the financial diet cycle, and it is one of the most destructive patterns in personal finance, not because it is dramatic, but because it is invisible. Nobody decides to blow their $10,000. Nobody wakes up and says, today I'm going to systematically undo 6 months of financial discipline. It happens gradually through a series of individually justifiable decisions that collectively add up to the same outcome. Let me walk you through exactly how the cycle works in practice, because I think recognizing the stages is the first step to interrupting them. Stage 1 is the sacrifice phase. This is the period of intense focus that gets you to $10,000. You cut subscriptions, you stopped eating out as much. You said no to things, you felt the friction of restriction every week, and you kept going because you had a clear goal pulling you forward. The goal was $10,000 and every dollar saved was measurable progress toward it. The discomfort had a clear purpose and a visible endpoint. Stage 2 is the arrival. You hit the number, the cortisol drops. The anxiety that was quietly running in the background of your financial life goes quiet for the first time in maybe years. This feeling is real and it is earned, and I do not want to minimize it. But this is also the exact moment the trap begins to close. Because here is what your brain registers when you hit $10,000. It registers completion, task done, goal achieved. And the restriction that was justified by the goal suddenly feels like it no longer has a reason to continue. You did the thing. Why are you still living like you are trying to do the thing? Stage 3 is the gradual release. This is where the spending creep begins. It rarely starts with a big purchase. It starts with small relaxations. You go out to dinner twice this week instead of once because you have been so disciplined lately and you deserve it. You upgrade something small because your old version was getting worn out and you can actually afford it now. You say yes to the trip because you have money saved, and that is literally what savings are for. None of these individual decisions is catastrophically wrong. The dinner is not a disaster, the trip is not a crisis. But each one is being justified by a mental accounting system that is quietly treating the $10,000 as a reward balance to be drawn down rather than a permanent new floor to be maintained and built upon. Stage 4 is the quiet alarm. Somewhere around the $7,000 or $6,000 mark, you open the app and feel a familiar tightening in your chest. The number that used to feel comfortable is starting to feel uncomfortable again. And here is where something really interesting and really damaging happens psychologically. Instead of immediately reversing course, most people do something that feels counterintuitive. They avoid looking at the number, they check the app less frequently, they stop doing their monthly budget review. Because looking at the shrinking number creates anxiety, and the brain's most immediate strategy for reducing anxiety is to remove the source of the information rather than address the underlying problem. I did this myself. I knew the money was going down. I just stopped looking at it as clearly because not knowing exactly how far it had fallen felt better than knowing. Which is of course exactly backwards from what a smart financial decision would be. But smart financial decisions are not primarily a logic problem. They are a psychology problem. And the psychology of watching something you worked hard to build start to disappear is genuinely difficult to sit with. Stage 5 is the reset. You are back below a number that feels uncomfortable. The restriction phase begins again. And the cycle repeats. Now I want to explain why this cycle happens at such a deep level, because understanding the surface pattern is useful, but understanding the root cause is what actually allows you to break it. The core issue is identity, specifically the mismatch between what you did to save $10,000 and who you believe yourself to be in relation to money. If you accumulated $10,000 through intense restriction and sacrifice, your mental model of how that money exists is built on a temporary behavioral change. You change what you did for a period of time to achieve a specific outcome, but if you did not simultaneously change how you think about yourself as a person who manages money, the behavior change has no anchor. It is a temporary state waiting for permission to end. Think about this in the context of dieting because the parallel is exact, and I think most people find it easier to recognize the pattern there. When someone goes on a highly restrictive diet to lose 20 pounds, the behavioral changes they make are enormous. They track everything, they say no constantly, they override their preferences dozens of times per day, they hit the goal, they feel incredible. And then for most people, within a year, a significant portion of the weight comes back. The research on why this happens is remarkably consistent. It is not because the person lacks discipline. It is because they went on a diet, meaning a temporary state of different behavior, rather than changing their identity to become someone who simply lives and eats differently as their baseline. The diet has an end, the identity change does not. The $10,000 psychological trap is the exact same mechanism applied to money. If you save $10,000 by going on a financial diet, meaning a temporary state of intense restriction, the $10,000 is the end point. You reached it. The diet is over. The money is available. And the old patterns that existed before the diet have been waiting patiently for the restriction to lift. The people who do not fall into this trap are not more disciplined than you. They are not doing harder math. They have just made a different kind of internal shift. They shifted from thinking of themselves as someone who is currently trying to save money to thinking of themselves as someone who has money saved. That shift sounds subtle. It is not. It changes every individual financial micro-decision that follows. Let me make this concrete because I do not want this to stay abstract. When you are someone who is trying to save money, the $10,000 in your account is the visible proof that the trying is working. It is the result of the effort. And since it is the result of effort rather than the baseline of who you are, it is always implicitly available to be spent when the effort feels like too much to continue. When you're someone who has money saved, the $10,000 is not a reward. It is not the finish line. It is just the minimum expression of who you are in relation to money. Spending it down does not feel like relaxing after discipline. It feels like becoming someone you are not. The identity protection mechanism works in your favor instead of against you. I want to tell you what this shift actually looked like for me practically, because I think hearing the specific behavior change is more useful than the concept alone. The first thing I did was stop treating my savings account balance as a number I was trying to grow and start treating it as a floor I was committed to defending. The framing shift sounds small, but it completely changes the decision calculus. Instead of asking myself whether I had saved enough this month, I started asking myself whether I had done anything that threatened the floor. Those are very different questions and they produce very different answers. The second thing I did was remove the psychological availability of the money. What I mean by that is I moved my savings to a separate high-yield savings account at a different bank than my checking account. Not because of the interest rate, though that is genuinely worth doing for the reasons I covered in my emergency fund video, but because out of sight genuinely means out of immediate psychological availability. When the money is 2 app switches and a 2-day transfer away instead of 1 tap away, it stops feeling like spending money and starts feeling like a separate thing entirely. A thing that belongs to a different version of my life than the current week's decisions. The third thing I did was replace the goal that was motivating me with a process. This is the piece I think matters most for long-term behavior change. When your motivation structure is built around hitting a specific number, you are always either motivated because you have not hit it yet or you have hit it and the motivation disappears. That is an inherently unstable system. When your motivation structure is built around being a specific type of person, the motivation does not have an endpoint. It just becomes part of how you move through your financial life every day. I want to address something directly because I think it comes up for a lot of people at this point in the conversation, and I want to make sure I am being fair about it. None of what I am describing means you cannot enjoy your money. That is not the point, and I want to be clear about that because I have seen personal finance advice that basically tells people to become ascetic monks in service of their net worth. And I find that both psychologically unhealthy and financially counterproductive because it sets up the same binge and restrict cycle I have been describing. The goal is not to never spend the money. The goal is to spend it intentionally from a position of genuine financial security rather than spending it reactively because the restriction phase has ended and the relief has created an unconscious permission to let the guard down. There is a version of reaching $10,000 that looks like this. You hit the milestone, you acknowledge it genuinely because it is genuinely worth acknowledging. You decide deliberately and in advance what the new floor is. Maybe it is $10,000. Maybe you decide $10,000 is your emergency fund floor and now you're building a separate investment account. You automate the continued contribution so the behavior does not depend on daily willpower. And you spend on the things that matter to you not because the restriction is over, but because you choose to and you can genuinely afford to without threatening the floor. That version of reaching $10,000 does not lead to erosion 6 months later. It leads to $15,000 and then $20,000, and then eventually a financial position that is genuinely different from where you started, not just temporarily different in the way that every financial diet is temporarily different. Let me give you the 3 specific things I want you to do this week if you're currently at or approaching $10,000, because I want this video to produce real action and not just a feeling of having learned something. First, name the floor. Decide right now what the minimum balance in your savings account is that you are committed to maintaining as a non-negotiable. Write it down. Put it somewhere you see it. Make it a decision you have already made so you do not have to remake it every time a spending temptation presents itself. Second, separate the money physically. If your savings are in the same account as your spending money, move them today. A different bank is better. The friction of transfer is a feature. Let the inconvenience work for you. Third, replace the milestone goal with an identity statement. I know this sounds like the soft psychological part, and I know some of you are going to roll your eyes at it. Do it anyway. Write down one sentence about the kind of person you are in relation to money, not the kind of person you are trying to become. The kind of person you are: I am someone who maintains financial security. I am someone who has money saved. I am someone who builds rather than burns. Whatever version of that sentence is true to you, write it, read it. Let it start doing the work that willpower cannot sustain on its own. The $10,000 milestone is real and it matters, but it is not the destination. It is the first moment you get to decide who you actually are with money. Make that decision deliberately and everything that follows gets easier. Make it by default, and the cycle I described at the start of this video will keep repeating until you do. Hit subscribe if this connected with you, because every week on this channel I sit down with you to work through exactly this kind of thing. The financial psychology that most money channels skip, because it is harder to put in a spreadsheet but easier to act on once you actually understand it. Share this with someone who just hit a savings milestone and deserves to keep it. This is Dave. I will see you in the next one.